Welcome to another AI Journal podcast episode. Today, we're going to be interviewing Andy Baillie, who has kindly joined us. And if you stick around to the end of the show, you'll be able to enter for an amazing prize that the team at Seismic have put together for you. Today, we're going to be looking at all things to do with content and how to utilize it. But first of all, I want to introduce Andy and have a look at who our guest is and get a bit of a background on who you are, Andy, and what your kind of experience is, please.
Thanks for having us, Tom. Thanks for having me today. So I currently run the financial services team for Seismic in Northern Europe, so UK, Scandinavia, Ireland. My job is really supporting our customers to make the most of the artificial intelligence components, machine learning components within our technology. They're all going through an extensive transformation. So I am primarily here to help them help their customers.
Very cool. And so looking at what Seismic does, and I know we've spoken before on a previous call, what was your story with them? How did you get into this space? So not just with Seismic, but with this kind of experience and what you're doing, where did it all begin for you, Andy?
Sure. So I'm actually a journalist by training. Many years ago, I wasn't a very good journalist. So ended up in sales in, let's say, more than 2 decades ago. Came through IBM, which is like the Death Star, and ended up at a place called DocuSign. So that was 12 years ago. DocuSign was, I guess, one of the first big automation sort of enterprise B2B plays. And after a few years there, have come over and are trying to repeat the same formula for Seismic within the European marketplace.
I've seen with DocuSign, Andy, that it's not the actual imagery or whatever else that really adds the value. It's the data, it's the content. And what probably you're seeing in organizations these days is a massive growth in content. What are you doing with content? What's Seismic attempting to do in terms of understanding it, using it, exploiting it, getting some ROI out of it? What would you be advising our listeners and users to do with everything that they have? And probably a lot of what they have, they don't even realize.
Yeah, sure. So as everyone, all of your listeners will know, the primary journey currently for content within business, obviously, is being able to personalize and make sure that what your consumers, your customers are receiving is highly relevant and specific to them. So if you imagine that what we've all grown up with is flat pieces of static content, which are generic because of the nature of the technologies with which they were assembled and then distributed, Seismic takes a fundamental shift. So we rewire that content. So what your consumers and your customers receive uses the data that we have around their preferences and then tailors content which is specific to what they're receiving. And that can be financial services products, it can be media products, it can be health products. The concept is use the data we have to understand what's important to people, and then make sure that we take those preferences and curate content around what we think will be appropriate and help them make better informed decisions.
When you're doing that, though, I'm trying to think here, because I have a lot of content, or we produce a lot of content in the AI Journal. But what are you doing with it? If you give us a couple of examples there, you mentioned finance, insurance, because I'm sort of looking at how do you curate content? How do you create content? How do you put content out there that's highly relevant? I'm assuming you're attempting to get, potential customers to take action off the back of that.
Yes.
Kind of like content marketing, maybe next best action, understand fraud. Is it some of that, all of that, or
it's all of that. So if you think about, I'll give you a specific use case. So in the world, and I'll give you a complex one, right? Because that's probably the toughest exam question out there, right? So if you take a wealth manager, so any of the wealth managers who work in the market today, what they have is a fair degree of data within all of their systems, but hopefully within their CRM system, whether that's Salesforce or Microsoft Dynamics. And within that data set, they understand what is important to their customer. However, they don't have the means today to act upon that data. So what Seismic does, Seismic reads the CRM system, right? So it looks at the profile of the customer, and then it says, okay, we know because we've got a machine learning component which understands and has analyzed what has worked previously. So which content has historically taken or had an effect on people who have a similar profile. And then it surfaces that content. So Seismic surfaces that content to the organization, to the wealth manager. And then that wealth manager then has the ability to personalize that content further. So it's very specific content, which is then further personalized by the relationship manager or the advisor, depending on who's responsible for that relationship. They will then distribute that content. All of this is done within Seismic. Seismic then reads or understands what is being read and for how long by the end point, by the end consumer. And then all of that data is aggregated and fed back into the organization. So ultimately what you have then is a meaningful set of data about which content is working for whom, what decisions they're making based on how that is then pushing the stages forward within the CRM system. Ultimately, does it result in a sale? And then all of that is fed back into the marketing organization, who have the ability to make decisions on where they spend their time and their money to create and improve upon their existing content. Sorry, I know that's a really long answer, but hopefully that's clear.
Yeah, it really is, because then that suggests you're doing a lot of outbound marketing or outbound content marketing that then results in actions that you want companies to take based on assets that they've got. Because the key thing, and I think we find this sometimes difficult, Tom, it's about creating really relevant content that resonates with really great audiences to get them to form the next best action. So if there's something AI related that was doing that in an automated fashion, gosh, it would certainly help tons of companies.
I love it as well, Andy, because looking at it from a content perspective, we always, or back in my previous marketing roles, I'd always say the saying, there's no point in writing something or designing a website or doing anything if no one's going to see it. And that's what I loved about Seismic. It really understands what's going to get you engagement, right? And what's going to get you outcomes and what's going to deliver results for you. So I think it's a really awesome way of looking at that. And I'd want to ask the question. So with all this new, as Kieran touched on, new data, new content, it's coming out quicker and quicker and quicker. How do we look at it, or how does a company look at it, or maybe a writer, a journalist, as we were touching on with you, Andy? How do they look at it as, how can I reduce this and how can I get more fine-tuned? What ways can people do that?
Well, that's the machine learning component that I mentioned earlier. So if you think about that journey that I just mentioned, just of that specific piece of content for that specific individual, what Seismic does is it aggregates all of those individual journeys into one single set of data. So at the sort of strategic level, if I'm the CMO of an organization and I'm sending out thousands of pieces of content, all of which are specifically tailored, but then I'm also receiving back through Seismic the analytics which allow me to match what content is being consumed, by whom and for how long, and critically, how that then is helping them make decisions based on what products they want to buy. So the challenge, therefore, is solved because, to your point about visibility, the old cliche is that if you've got a CMO, they know that 50% of their content is working, but they don't know which 50%, right? So that's a problem. That's an output that we solve.
Can I ask just one question? Because, Andy, you mentioned there a lot about content. 50% works, 50% doesn't. A lot of people might suggest you delete old content. But there's a lot of arguments that says, look, never delete any content at all because it can provide some value over the longer term. What are you discovering, or what's your software discovering?
So anecdotally, we've got lots of customers who have retired a lot of their content. And that's just because they now finally have explicit data around what's being consumed and what isn't. So I'll give you an example. One of our customers is IBM. And within a few weeks of going live on Seismic, they retired hundreds of thousands of pieces of their content because they finally they kind of knew, right? They sort of had a strong sort of premonition that some of their content wasn't being used or wasn't being constructively used, I should say. But now they finally had data which showed what was interesting to their customers and what was actually making sales happen. So they retired hundreds of thousands of pieces of content. Also, anecdotally, one of the very large financial services organizations we work with, global, they had a similar challenge, which is they had loads of content, a lot of which was very expensively assembled because there was lots of thought pieces, white papers, etc. And after using Seismic, within the first 6 months, they ended up with a 70% reduction. So their CMO finally had that level of granular detail. What's working, what isn't working, what's helping us focus and drive the business forward and create more sales, what's the productivity output. But then also, actually, if I've got a budget of X million and it's largely built around creating more content, perhaps we should be doing more of that and less of the stuff which we know, because we have the data, is obsolete. So that was it. It was just about reshifting or shifting their focus away from the stuff which was not working anymore.
Gosh, maybe an expensive lesson there. Brave CMO to chuck away 70% of what they had.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But it's the data. That's the thing. It's the insight that you've got. You know, if you've got something, like I said earlier, which is explicit and says this is working and this isn't, right? And obviously we'd never recommend people throw away 70% of their content from day one. But once you've got that data set which allows you to make those kind of decisions, then actually that's a hopefully fairly straightforward decision.
Yeah. And I always come from it. I look at loving, and you taught me this as well, Kieran, using analysis to a certain degree of understanding what's working and what's not working. And it seems like Seismic can do this to really picture to you through a visual story of what is and what isn't. But I'd love to know, Andy, when you're creating this kind of content, are there any trends you can share with our audience that you think these are kind of good points to do and these are kind of bad points to do from having this kind of experience? Are there any takeaways you can give people to say this is a good framework and it's a proven framework? This might not be such a good framework.
Well, the trends that we see. So, Tom, I think that's really important because you know we're all consumers, we're all social media. I think the experience of the last 24 hours shows us the impact. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I'm still traumatized. But you know what we've gained as consumers over the last 2 years, 3 years, with the prevalence of consumption of social media platforms, is people react to much more interactive content now. So if you want to attract, it doesn't matter what you're selling, right? You can be selling cars, you can be selling insurance, you can be selling anything. What is important to consumers, whether they're B2C or B2B, is the ability to have attractive content which is relevant put in front of them, right? So we're much more sophisticated as buyers. We're much more, we're much less patient in terms of actually going into the detail. We know how to find information that's important to us. So from a marketing perspective, how can you make that content more attractive? Well, use video, use interactive means of making sure that content is in line with everyone's expectation as a consumer, right? The distinction between a B2B and a B2C preference actually is fairly blurred now. So certainly make sure that it's attractive, and that will make sure that you've got a much higher response rate.
Very good.
Yeah, interesting. I've seen Satya Nadella recently, Andy, mentioned that we're all going to be, product and content companies.
Yes.
Everybody's going to become a creator. What's your thoughts on that? Would you argue with him or would you agree with him?
I'd be brave if I argued with Satya, and foolish as well. No, I think he's absolutely right. I mean, I remember actually, and I think it was actually Bill Gates who said content is king back in the 90s, right? So he turned out to be right. And look, I think we all have the ability now to edit, right? We all have the ability to publish. We can all distribute, and whether that's within our business lives or within our personal lives, those tools are available. We've all got apps which we can use. So certainly, I think the battle for share of wallet, and I'm talking about the B2B world, is very similar to the share of wallet you have, or the share of wallet battle you have within the B2C world, right? You have to be able to understand that your content is what differentiates you, either as a person, as a brand, or as a business, from everyone else who's out there in the online world.
Where do you see it going the next 5-10 years, if you're brave enough to jump that far ahead, or maybe the next 3? How do you see the industry or content industry going forward?
What we're seeing at the moment is a lot of consolidation. So actually, and I touched on this at the start, the experience of our customers is largely transformation at this stage. And for all of the external factors that have affected us all over the last 2 years, that's recently been accelerated. And I also think, going back to what we were saying just now about consumer expectations and behaviors, that's also been accelerated as well. So at the moment, I think in the B2B world, everyone is now figuring out how they can make sure they've got attractive, interactive content, which they can assemble quickly, measure, and then reconstitute quickly. So the cycles around the production of content are coming right down, which is an automation play as well. The trends, I think we will see a lot more proliferation of content, and I think the AI component will be even stronger. So actually having a series of decisions made on our behalf by our machines is certainly the trend that we're going to see evolving.
Yeah. And I'd love to know, Andy, when you're looking at this, what advice can we give our audience that are listening in when we're looking at whether it's a business or it's just an individual? They're thinking, oh, we've got so much content, or I'm looking to ramp up my content. What kind of things would you say they need to consider as a starting point, or what kind of questions would you pose to them, Andy?
I'd sort of answer on behalf of the customers we work with, which is a lot of them are going back to the fundamentals. So they appreciate, and in some cases, these are sort of, 200-year-old financial institutions. So they have extremely strong brands and extremely strong brand loyalty. So for them, it's about understanding how they then project that strength or that brand forward into a more digital or a more digitally consumable future. And a lot of that is actually rewiring their businesses. So they're actually moving away from being financial services organizations and actually becoming technology organizations who perhaps happen to sell financial services products. So it's a fundamental shift away from what went before. The catalyst obviously has been the pandemic, amongst other things, and being able to sort of imagine how you want to interact with everyone, and I mean everyone, in 3, 5, 10 years' time.
Yeah. And I love the idea of it, because you think how easy it is to access so many people now. And it's really interesting, because it was 2 days ago I was reading a book of how you have so many platforms to go down, and you can literally reach everyone potentially, or at least everyone that's on the internet. But because everyone can do that, there's so many distractions, which is what I love about your content. How do we make it so applicable while matching the trend and while make it engaging? It's a increasingly hard thing to do, even though we've got increasingly new and more methods of communicating with someone, because it is the biggest touch point. So really, really exciting topic, and really interested to talk to you, Andy, and really grateful for your time. People will want to know where to find you. I've got a lot more questions, and maybe we'll take it on another call. But where can they find you? Where can they find out more about Andy, more about Seismic, and more importantly, where can they find out more about this competition?
So the competition, I think we're going to have embedded in the chat. So hopefully your listeners will be able to catch them there. Alternatively, we're seismic.com. Seismic as in earthquake.
That'll be awesome. And we'll put all that in the show notes for everyone watching today. And if you have any questions, you can leave them there, and we'll be following up to make sure they all get answered. But other than that, Andy, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on, and really appreciate you taking the time today. It's been an enjoyable session. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks, Andy.
Thanks, guys.